Allison, my wife, sometimes calls me a jackass for justice. Now, I learned on the ride in from the airport yesterday that apparently having a jackass on the farm can be really good because they can be very protective of other animals. And so there's something fitting, I think, in this metaphor. I had another colleague that once said, "Kevin, you care about justice too much." And this really perplexed me because I think justice is a virtue. And so I don't know what it means to have a virtue too much. That's roughly like saying, "You have too much hope." So why does Allison say this about me? Well, for the last 4 years, I've spent a few hours every week doing some pro bono disability work. One of our children, our son, is multiply disabled. He is missing just a little chunk of one of his chromosomes. So the green bit over there and one copy of chromosome 2 is just gone. He's one of about 50 diagnosed cases in the world. And we found out about 3 months into his first grade year that since he started kindergarten at his public school in Idaho, that the school wasn't following state or federal law, especially the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So I did what I think every parent ought to do in that sort of situation. I got angry. And then I figured out how to try and harness that anger to do something about it, to fight for justice, to make things better, both because he's my child and because of his disabilities. He's dependent on me, I think, to work towards his good, at least for now. Someday he'll be able to do that on his own. Now, a doctorate in philosophy isn't worth a whole lot sometimes, but I'm good at downloading texts and reading texts and making arguments. So when we realized that the school was violating his education, I downloaded the Idaho Special Education Manual, and I read it. And Allison and I figured out how to put pressure on his school district to actually follow the law. I'm good at making arguments. One of my favorite parts of this law is the claim that each public agency must ensure that, to the maximum extent appropriate, children with disabilities are educated with children who are not disabled, and special education, special classes, separate schooling, or other removal of children with disabilities from the regular educational environment occurs only, I like that qualifier, only if the nature or severity of the disability is such that education in regular classes with the use of supplementary aids and services cannot be achieved satisfactorily. For over a year, the school hadn't even tried to educate our son in a general education classroom with non-disabled peers. Confronting the school wasn't a super fun experience. Right? Confrontation for its own sake is not something that even I enjoy. But I'm good at doing something when I'm angry. And I got good at leveraging the law to our son's advantage. So we started writing letters. We started making sure that the school communicated everything with us in writing. Having stuff in writing was our friend. Here's a sample of one of our letters. According to the Idaho State Department of Education Manual, Chapter 6, Section 3, Federal Reporting of the Least Restrictive Environment, the idea that you educate children, if at all possible, in with their typical peers, rather than put them in more restrictive special education classes. The IEP, the legal document that describes a child with a disability's special education, includes a section for reporting the educational environments required for the federal December 1 child count, federal law. In our previous letter, we specifically asked for this information, and we still have not been provided with the minutes that Jameson spent in the gen ed classroom during the entire last academic year. We are hereby formally asking for that information within 10 business days. As we are sure you are aware, schools are required to document the amount of time that students spend in the gen ed classroom for purposes of federal reporting. So either one of the following two options is the case. Option 1 is that the school did not, in fact, track the time that our son spent in the general education classroom, violating federal law. Option 2 is that the school did track this information, but is consistently refusing to give it to us. Now, our son's educational record is something we have access to, so again, in option 2, they'd also be violating federal law. Neither option is acceptable to us. Now, I wonder why my wife calls me a jackass. Right? Which is it? And they were forced to admit that they haven't even tried to collect the data for over a year. Another issue, when a teacher calls in sick, what does the school district do? They get a substitute teacher so that the kids in that classroom can access their education. Well, our son needs aides in the classroom to help him access his education. What did they do when an aide called in sick? Nothing. They sent him an extra time in the special education room, not accessing his education. So we asked the school, would you allow a non-disabled student to not be educated on a day simply because his teacher called in sick? Well, no. So why do you do that for our son? It seems an awful lot like disability discrimination. Would you like a lawsuit? Of course, they answered no. So over the next few months, we got really good at advocating for our son. We got the district to change its policy. Our son was being bused over 5 miles to a school with other students with disabilities, when from the back of our house, we could see the neighborhood school. We got them to allow him to attend the neighborhood school. We got our son to be included in the gen ed classroom with his non-disabled peers, as the law is supposed to default to, for over half the time of his school day. We got additional aides hired because they needed aides for him and other children to be in that education classroom. We got the director of special education to be forcibly reassigned for a year until he was allowed to retire by the school district. In short, we advocated for our child. We made great progress for him, but I know he wasn't the only one being mistreated in an underfunded and inept structure and school district. If we had this problem, and we're fairly highly educated, I've got a pretty flexible job, I can go to 8 hours of meetings in a given week if I'm going to have to. Think about all the other families whose parents don't know the law, who have 2 jobs that doesn't allow them to be in the school advocating, who aren't quite as comfortable making these sorts of arguments. So I started doing what we were doing for our son, for other families. And 22 Advocacy was born. This is our advocacy company. I worked with another family. Their son was 2 years behind his classmates in terms of academic performance. Their son has cerebral palsy. He has no intellectual or cognitive or learning disability. But because of his physical disability, they weren't even trying to have him in with his class. And so they weren't educating him. And then they were saying the reason he can't be in with his age-appropriate peers is because he's behind grade level. So over the course of 18 months, we got him from being in the classroom with his age-appropriate peers, none, to the entire school day. There was another family that their primary language was Spanish. So they would come to these meetings, and federal law says the school district has to provide language interpreters. And the school district had never even offered an interpreter. I don't know Spanish. We found a woman that did know Spanish. I went as an advocate, and we made sure that that family got some progress. For me, advocacy became a kind of activism. I never thought of myself as a political activist, but now I do. I love this line from Clara Clow. I've adopted it as the motto for our advocacy company. I guess I'm an activist. I think it's just caring. For me, this activism was an outgrowth of my commitment to justice. It was what I thought justice demanded of me for people in my community. I think it's actually part of the church's prophetic task that we sometimes don't do so well. I love last week's Old Testament lectionary reading from Jeremiah. Today I appoint you over nations and kingdoms to uproot and tear down, to destroy and overthrow. to build and to plant. We're called to build and to plant. We're called to build peace and justice in our communities. But when we encounter unjust systems, unjust structures, when because of those unjust structures, the vulnerable, the oppressed, the outcast, the marginalized are mistreated, we are called to tear them down. We're all dependent on other people in our communities as humans. None of us can do it all of ourselves. But some of us are a bit more vulnerable than others. Some of us need others to advocate on our behalf. And it is our responsibility to work for the good of those in our community, not just for their own good, but for the good of the community as a whole.